So the first idea, finding patterns. So, patternicity is the word I coined. The tendency to find meaningful patterns in both meaningful and meaningless noise. And agencicity, the tendency to imbue those patterns with potential agents. There's something or somebody behind the pattern pulling the strings. And, again, the key point here is that some patterns are real. So the thought experiment, so it's a signal detection problem. Which one are real, which one are not? Assume more things are real than actually are, rather than the other way around, just in case.
Negativity bias.
Yes, yeah, negativity bias, right, exactly. People that believe conspiracy theories, to them, they really are conspiracies. They've uncovered a true conspiracy. And in this case, there really are conspiracies. Conspiracies happen all the time. I give tons of examples in the book: the assassination of Lincoln, Watergate, the start of World War I with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand by the Serbian nationalists, conspiracy of corporations to cheat the regulatory state like Big Pharma. When RFK Jr. talks about Big Pharma capturing the regulatory state, that's not a crazy conspiracy theory. It actually happened.
They get fined millions every year.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it's true. They do this, and and that's a conspiracy. So I try to demystify the word conspiracy, crazy conspiracy. Oh, he's just one of those crazy conspiracists. No, I think, there's a kind of rationality behind assuming that there are more conspiracies than there are, just in case.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Chasing Consciousness. So today we have the somewhat uncomfortable topic of how our brains often believe things which simply aren't true. And the topic fits perfectly with our theme for Series 4, Self-transcendence versus Self-delusion. Now, our innate ability to notice patterns in systems, assign agency, and find meaning in the world are among the reasons we've evolved to become so successful at predicting, understanding, and creating meaningful collaborations in the world. But the issue with these abilities is that we might make the mistake of thinking what the brain assigns to the world for its own survival is necessarily true for the world itself. Sure, our brains do track the truth, but the truth isn't always what's needed for survival. So issues like negativity bias, confirmation bias, creating narrative stories that conveniently map onto our existing worldview have become a deeply ingrained part of our society. Now, add to this the modern phenomena like siloing of information by the internet into small echo chambers, algorithmic amplification of memes led by the internet's business model of maximizing engagement, decreasing trust in institutions as economic inequality in the world just increases exponentially. And you just get a perfect storm of clashing beliefs about the truth. Now, fortunately, our guest today is one of the most established skeptical voices in science, who reminds us, whether or not we agree to what extent, that we really need to closely track the difference between what we can collectively confirm to be true and what our brains project to be true from the inside out. And he is, of course, New York Times bestselling author and founding publisher of Skeptic magazine, Michael Shermer. He wrote for 18 years for the Scientific American. He's written 9 books. But today we're going to be focusing on his books, The Believing Brain, and his new release, Conspiracy: Why Rational People Believe Irrational Things. Now, I wanted to speak to Michael about the believing brain ever since I started covering these effects, like the left brain interpreter, like negativity bias on the show. So I really can't wait to get into this. So without further ado, let's go. Oh, Michael Shermer, welcome to the show.
Nice to see you. Thanks for having me.
It's a great
I'm doing
pleasure.
well.
Now, Mike, I love to start by going back to my guest's very first deep questions, usually sometime between sort of 8 to 12 years old. What were your first impressions and reflections about life and the world that may have some way influenced your future work?
Yeah, in terms of like early influences on what I do now, Not really, other than just being super curious and reasonably modest, I guess. I had kind of a sense of my own intelligence as not being that high compared to other people I would meet, and thinking, yeah, I really need to kind of be humble here before the world because there's a lot I don't know and I'm not that good at it. And I've always actually kind of felt that way. Even my job now where I interact with the smartest people in the world, and I always feel like I could tell this guy's smarter than me. So I'm just going to listen because he probably knows something I don't know. And I think maybe that's a good trait to have. Intellectual humility is technically called. I might be wrong. So it's good to keep an open mind, not be too confident in your beliefs. I mean, there's certain things I'm really confident about, like theory of evolution or something like that. But most things I'm not that confident on, and maybe that comes from my childhood. A lot of it's genetics. We have to remember you inherit from your parents not only the household environment, but their genes, and half of temperament is accounted for by genetics. And my mom was pretty smart, as was my dad, medium smart, I would say. My mom was super ambitious and hardworking, high energy. My father was super nice guy, just high in agreeableness, high in openness to experience. By temperament, a good guy. And I think I inherited a lot of those traits from both my parents. So, something like that.
Yeah, and I think this humility keeps coming up on the show, just the humility we need in the face of the unknown. And the great scientific project is exploring that unknown. So the presence of dogma in such a situation really does seem almost absurd. Now, Michael, before we get into the science from your book, The Believing Brain, and what it means for your new book, Conspiracy, as our second skeptic on the show, following our in-house skeptic, Sue Blackmore, who I
Oh,
continue, I continue to
Sue. I
admire
love Sue.
back.
Oh my God. She's one of my
She,
heroes. She's one of those
she,
people, again, that I would say, when I met her and read her early on, read her before I met her, it's like, oh, this is incredible. She's obviously super smart, but also experiential. She actually did these things. She believed in the paranormal. She, tried to do whatever paranormal experiences and so on. I really admired her skepticism because it's not just armchair. I mean, she really tried to get to the core of what's really true. What can we know?
and she's still fascinated by the mystery. And she really, really keeps my often too open-minded feet on the ground. And I'm sure you'll help us do the same, Michael. So I wanted to start briefly with the philosophical tradition of skepticism itself, which philosopher David Chalmers described here on the show as the idea that you can't ever really know anything for sure. Is that how you describe it, Michael?
Well, technically that's true. But how far do you want to take that? I mean, all the way to solipsism, where I don't even know if you exist or anything else exists. This is all in my head. That not very many philosophers go that far. I certainly don't. Or the, kind of more traditional definitions of skepticism, one who doubts everything. Well, if you took that literally, then you never get out of bed and go to work or count on buying a house or, having friendships or anything because you wouldn't trust anything works. How do I know the money's going to be in my bank account at the Bank of America tomorrow? Well, I don't 100% know. The whole thing could be a scam or, the Bank of America could go out of business tomorrow and lock up my assets and I'm screwed. But you can't live your life like that. Most of the time we default to truth, as it's called. We tend to believe what other people tell us because who has time to fact check everything? This guy could be bullshitting me, but it's not important, and I don't have the time to do it anyway. So I'll just go ahead and believe him. I think a lot of it is like that, like the stolen election of 2020 theory, conspiracy theory. I'm not an election expert. I wouldn't even know who to call in Georgia or Arizona to find out what that truck was doing with those boxes of ballots at 3 a.m. or whatever. But I know people who does it, who checks that, the election officials in Arizona and Georgia who are Republicans, who wanted Trump to win, who voted for Trump, and they still said, we looked into it, hoping to find some irregularities, and we didn't. And our commitment is to the truth, not to our political party. To me, as an outsider, because I'm not a political scientist or anything like that, that is all you need to know. For the most part, to function. yes, it's possible it was stolen, but at this point, after 36 lawsuits and, the Attorney General, Bill Barr, who was a Trump appointed person who voted for Trump, who wanted Trump to win, who still said, nope, there's nothing there. That's a way of kind of a secondary confirmation of the truth value of a claim. I can't check it personally myself, but that guy can, and he'd be motivated to find it if it was true, and he didn't. It's like Christopher Hitchens famously said, quoting somebody else, that, if you hear the Pope say he believes in God, you think, well, the Pope's doing his job again today. But if you hear the Pope saying, I'm beginning to have some doubts about God's existence, you think, oh, he might be onto something. Right. So I think a lot of that goes into our factoring of, what we should believe, and so when I hear something about, climate change skepticism, are you a global warming skeptic, or are you skeptical of the global warming skeptics, which is me? I'm skeptical of them. Well, why? I'm not a climate scientist, but I do know how science works. I know a lot of climate scientists. I know how competitive the scientific enterprise is. I know, what goes on at conferences and peer-reviewed papers and so on. And while there are flaws in the system, the peer-reviewed system, p-hacking and the file drawer problem and so on and so forth, for the most part, it works pretty well. So if when I read that, out of 10,000 papers published in climate science, that 97% of them come to the same conclusion, anthropogenic global warming, I think it's probably true. Without being I can't read the papers myself. They're pretty technical, these computer models and mathematical equations and so on. It's not what I do, but I'm reasonably confident that they got it right. Now, it's possible the 3%, are onto something and the 97% are wrong. That has happened in the past, but probably not.
Now, I want to just continue setting the context here, because in your book, The Moral Arc, How Science and Reason Lead Humanity Towards Truth, Justice, and Freedom, you start by quoting Robert Oppenheimer, the physicist who built the hydrogen bomb. And the quote is so close to the whole mission statement of Chasing Consciousness. I just have to read it aloud for the listeners.
Yeah, read it.
Before we get started.
Yeah, it's my favorite quote.
There must be no barriers to freedom of inquiry. There is no place for dogma in science. The scientist is free and must be free to ask any question, to doubt any assertion, to seek for any evidence, to correct any errors. Our political life is also predicated on openness. We know that the only way to avoid error is to detect it, and the only way to detect it is to be free to inquire. And we know that as long as men are free to ask what they must, free to say what they think, free to think what they will, freedom can never be lost, and science can never regress. Oh, it gives me goosebumps. That quote's from 1949.
I know.
I can't think of a more noble call to truth and freedom of inquiry, and to be able to doubt dogma. And I love the fact that you wrote an entire book about the equivalence between using reason to seek truth and morality. And it really comes across in the openness with which you discuss the work of scientists. You're skeptically challenging. So by means of sort of championing this philosophy, which is obviously something you live by, is there anything you want to use from what you call in that book, the science of morality, for the listeners to take forward in this conversation, which will probably involve a lot of refuting, doubting, and error correcting?
Well, in general, I like the Oppenheimer quote, because he's tying in, what he is, physicist, physical sciences, and the biological science we think of as science, with political issues. It's like, well, aren't those two different things? No, they're not. Actually, most political, economic, moral issues are really factual issues. Well, what's the truth? What's actually true for us to make a decision? Now, not all things, like, as you know, there's a huge crisis of immigration in the United States right now. I mean, there's people pouring over the southern border right down the street from me here. I'm in Santa Barbara, 200 miles south of San Diego. They're pouring in thousands of people a day. Okay. I've long kind of fallen on the more open borders side of the argument. Not completely, of course. You got to have borders, but rather than tighten them up, let's loosen them up a little bit. There's room for debate there. But at some point, it's like, well, this is too many. Okay, what's the number? I don't know what the number is. There is no number. It's like asking when life begins, on the abortion issue, 6 weeks, 10 weeks, 18 weeks, 20 weeks, 22 weeks. there is no perfect place to draw the line that science tells us there. That's the day that the lights come on in terms of consciousness and sentience at week 22, day 3, whatever. It's just not how it works. But a lot of other issues they are factual, that if we just have more information, we can get the right answer, more or less for most people most of the time. And so that's, I try to kind of think of them. This is what's called moral realism, that there really is right and wrong. And there is objective morality. Again, not for everything, but, this idea that you can't derive an ought from an is, I think is, just the naturalistic fallacy, which I think is a fallacy. I think it's a fallacy. It's not true. We do it all the time. Why did we abolish slavery? And abolish torture and capital punishment in most countries? And why do we have civil rights and women's rights, children's rights and workers' rights and gay rights and so on? Why do we have these things? Is it really just completely random? Some cultures stumbled into that and others didn't, and it could all go back the other way. Who knows? No, that's never going to happen. It's, there's no country in the world that's going to say, you know what, let's abolish the right for women to vote. There's no women that are going to put up with that. And, short of a dictatorial regime like North Korea or something like that, Saudi Arabia, maybe they were the last to give women the right to vote. It's short of something like that. It's not likely to happen in a democracy like the United States or any Western country. And I'm arguing that the reason we have that is, say, the franchise for women, is because that's what women want. And they're half the population. And, they have a preference that's built in by nature to prefer freedom to slavery, or education to, ignorance, to literacy to illiteracy, health to disease, satiation to starvation. I mean, people would rather be healthy than diseased. Why? Because that's part of our nature. We want to survive and flourish. So I'm arguing that in the same way we discover laws about nature that dictate the motion of planets and evolution of life and so on, is the same for human social arrangements and what people want by nature. And there are certain obvious things. Abraham Lincoln famously said, if slavery is not wrong, nothing's wrong. And I would say, if the Holocaust is not wrong, nothing's wrong. I mean, is it possible that some anthropologists someday will find some community of people who like being enslaved, or who want to gas people in gas chambers? No, I don't think so. I would be very surprised, because that's not part of human nature. So I think there is something to be discovered about moral truths. Again, not everything, but at least let's abandon the idea that it's all. Here's where I'm coming from: is that you have this kind of false dichotomy between theistic morality, divine command theory. God said it's good. God said it's bad. That's it. And if you reject that, like I do, because I'm an atheist, but even most philosophers, whether they're atheists or not, reject it for other reasons we can get into later. But what we're presented with is the alternative, is that anything goes, moral relativism. Your culture says it's okay to mutilate the genitals of females. My culture says it's not. Oh, who's to say which is the better one? Well, I'll tell you. Ask the women. They'll tell you. Most of them. Again, some young girls are raised brainwashed by their culture. They don't even know what's different choices that they could have. But for the most part, we can say certain things about certain cultures that really are better than other cultures based on these, kind of foundational principles we can discover by just studying human nature.
Now, the last tool that we need by means of sort of context setting for the rest of this conversation is to understand something that you call the painful process of scientific revolutions overturning consensus. Now, these revolutions that are part of the history of science particularly interest me, not least because I think we may be on the brink of entering another one. Can you tell us about the big ones from history of science? And if you agree that we may be on the brink of another one?
Well, certainly. It's probably going to be in areas, that are less well trodden. It's like physics has been worked over pretty well, as has biology. Not likely we're going to get another huge grand theory Although the moment you say that, you think, well, wait a minute, what about dark energy and dark matter? That's, 96% of the entire universe. We don't even know what it is. So it's possible there'll be another Einstein that comes along that unites quantum physics with global relativity, general relativity, sorry. That's possible. It's possible Darwin was wrong, or there's some modification of Darwinian evolution, maybe. So we have to keep an open mind. But I think the other areas that are less trod, the name of your show, right? What is consciousness? I see that Christoph Koch just paid David Chalmers a case of wine for a bet they made 25 years ago that the hard problem of consciousness will be solved by 2023. And it's not, I mean, even if just for fun, you just look on the Wikipedia page, hard problem of consciousness, there's like 22 theories or something. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's like, okay, you guys can't be even remotely close to solving this problem if you have that many theories, right? I mean, if it was down to 2 or 3, like the Big Bang Theory versus steady state theory in the 1950s, then it works out after a few decades. It's obviously the Big Bang is the right one. Steady state theory is the wrong one. Pretty much end of the story. That hasn't happened with consciousness. Now, it's possible, I've played with this idea in my next book called Truth, that it's an unknowable problem. That is, it's an insoluble problem because of the way it's construed conceptually, that you can't get at it. That is, the easy problem of consciousness, what's the neural correlates of consciousness? What's the wiring that leads to the perception of the color red? I don't know why it's always the color red, but in any case. But the next step, the hard problem, what's it like to be the wiring? It's like, well, how would I know? I mean, I know what it is in my head because I experienced it, the qualia, but there's no possible way for you to know what my red looks like, because the little homunculus in your head can't tiptoe over into my head and look at the Cartesian theater of my mind and go, oh, Shermer's red looks like mine. Oh, okay. This is an ill-conceived thought experiment, I think. What's it like to be me? You can't know. And what's it like to be you? I can't ever know, really. So, there's, I don't know how the hard problem would even be solved.
You call it the uncomfortable, the painful process. Give us a couple of examples from the history of science that have been particularly painful.
Well, of course, the Copernican revolution starts it off, knocking us off our pedestal. Most of these are pedestal smashing ideas. Darwin's theory of evolution. We're not special. The Copernican principle, we're not special. Or the principle of mediocrity. We're not. Again, we're mediocre. We're in the middle of the bell curve. And I would say, those are the two big ones. Of course, so much about the human mind is not known. I do think that the sense that we're natural born dualists, almost everybody's a dualist intuitively. It feels like there's thoughts floating around in my head. It's how we can watch movies like Freaky Friday and get the humor of Lindsay Lohan and Jamie Lee Curtis switching bodies. And the teenage girl is now the middle-aged mom, and the mom is back in high school in the teenage girl's body, and hilarity ensues. Well, what's actually switching? Because there's no switching. It's just your brain. But this idea that there's something called the mind separate from the brain is hard to get around. Now, I'm a materialist. I'm a monist. I think there's just brain, and the mind is just a word we use to describe what the brain is doing. It's a process. But we don't really know for sure, how it is that just molecules swapping across synaptic gaps leads to this thing you and I are doing now, experiencing the world. And so I don't know. But, back to your first question about truth, there's just so much we don't know, and what the upcoming revolutions are. I don't know. If I knew what they were, I'd be, into it myself. But that's why I'd love to live another 500 years, be chronically frozen or brought back and go, oh, so that's what dark energy is. Oh, that's what consciousness is. Oh, it was so obvious. How can we have not seen that? Right. But, but I don't know. And you don't either. Nobody does.
Right. So with that in mind, listeners, let's get into the meat of today's conversation. Our quite extraordinary believing brain, the subject of your book of the same name. Now, I would love for you to be able to break down some of the main points you make in that book, these features of this very successful evolution. that led us to, firstly, seeing patterns where often there's none. Secondly, assigning agency and intention to nature where often there's none. And lastly, assigning meaning to life where perhaps there is none. These three things I want to break down. And interestingly, they're all really, really useful in our evolution, but really risky, as I was mentioning in the introduction, because we might mistake thinking that what's useful for our survival and true for our survival is necessarily true of the rest of the world. Can you break that science down for us, Michael? Feel free to take your time.
Yeah, sure. So the first idea, finding patterns. So, patternicity is the word I coined. The tendency to find meaningful patterns in both meaningful and meaningless noise. And agencicity, the tendency to imbue those patterns with potential agents. There's something or somebody behind the pattern pulling the strings. And, again, the key point here is that some patterns are real. So the thought experiment, so it's a signal detection problem. Which one are real, which one are not? So my thought experiment is, imagine you're a hominid on the plains of Africa and you hear a rustle in the grass. Is it a dangerous predator or is it just the wind? Now, so you can make two types of errors. Type 1 error, false positive. You think that the rustle on the grass is a dangerous predator. Turns out it's just the wind. That's a false positive. But if you make the other kind of error, a type 2 error, false negative, you think the rustle on the grass is just the wind, and it turns out it is a dangerous predator, then you're lunch. So that's, you've been given a Darwin Award for taking yourself out of the gene pool early. And so I'm arguing that evolution would have selected for us to make more type 1 than type 2 errors. Assume more things are real than actually are, rather than the other way around, just in case.
Negativity bias.
Yes. Yeah. Negativity bias. Right. Exactly. Now, why can't the animal just stay there and collect more data to know for sure? Veridical perception. We want to get it right. Because predators don't wait around for prey animals to collect more data. That's why they're camouflaged. That's why they stalk their prey. That's why they get upwind rather than downwind of their prey and so on. They don't want the prey animal to collect more data on them. So it's an arms race, an evolutionary arms race. Again, part of this signal detection. Is it real or not? And it's good to get it right more often than wrong. So that's the kind of the game theory logic behind it. And in my book, I have lots of experimental examples of this and research and so on. And, you can apply this model to almost anything. Everything is a signal detection, problem. Is COVID-19 in, let's say, winter of 2020, is this going to be a super deadly virus that kills hundreds of millions of people, or like maybe billions of people around the world? Is it going to be like Ebola or AIDS? HIV, was 100% fatal until the late 90s. So, or is it just going to be like a bad flu, and therefore we should carry on with business as usual? In the first scenario, you want to shut everything down, close the schools, close the restaurants, and mask everybody up, social isolation, and so on, just in case. In the second scenario, you made the right decision, carry on business as usual because it's not that bad. The problem is the other the two types of errors, type 1 and type 2. You thought it was going to be business as usual and it's not that bad, and you keep everything open, and 100 million people die on your watch. Let's say you're president or governor or mayor or whatever, or head of the CDC. Well, you can't make that kind of error. So I understand why they err on the other side. But the problem is if a few people did the other calculation. What happens if it's a moderate disease? It's kind of bad, not horrible, but it's worse than the flu. But we shut everything down and closed the economy, and now we have massive inflation. We had to spend trillions of dollars to keep the economy going and keep people fed and so on. And children are now 2 years behind in school. So that decision was not without consequences. Again, it's that 2x2 grid of a signal detection problem. The two types of errors, the two types of hits. And, everything in life is basically a signal detection problem, not just in science, but in your personal life. Decisions you make, should I take this job or not? Should I marry this person or not? And so on. And I think thinking rationally about those things in that kind of game theoretic model, or if you want to do it in a Bayesian reasoning, kind of put some probabilities on it and see if you can make a decision that way. back to your first question about the truth and what Chalmers told you. Well, technically that's right. But we don't, it doesn't have to be black and white where it's like a light switch. We either know the truth or we don't know anything. Well, no, there's degrees of confidence we can have. And this is the Bayesian way of thinking about it. I'm 1% confident, I'm 10%, I'm 50%, I'm 70%. And by even just thinking of it that way, even if you can't put an exact number on it, just thinking of it that way allows you to be open to being wrong. In which you say, well, at the moment, I'll just use an example that's popular now is UFOs, UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena, or now anomalous phenomena. What are those things? Could they be aliens? Okay, I'm very doubtful of that. Very, very doubtful, but not 100% doubtful. That is, I would not put a zero on the hypothesis that UAPs represent extraterrestrials intelligences, but I would put like maybe a 0.01%. And so this is called Cromwell's rule in Bayesian reasoning. Oliver Cromwell, I beseech you in the bowels of Christ to think you might be wrong. You might be mistaken. So in Bayesian reasoning, never assign a 0 or a 1 to anything, just in case. 1, well, what if you're wrong? 0, what if you're wrong? Okay, so but by not doing that, by giving it some credence, even if it's tiny, 0.01%, it allows you to say, well, okay, with new evidence, I'll change my mind. I'll increase my credence I'll give it a 1%. I'll give it a 10%, whatever. And so it allows us to have an open conversation and dialogue without the moralizing about being right or wrong or moral or immoral about your beliefs, by just saying, this is what I think at the moment, but please tell me what you know. Try to convince me. I'll change my mind. Show me. I tell this to the ufologists all the time, on pretty much daily on Twitter. They're going on, this is it. Disclosure's coming, any moment now. And it's like, I doubt it, but show me. Show us where's the spacecraft? The alien body. The government has the alien bodies. Really? Oh, I'm 100% sure. Show it to us. Well, I can't. It's classified. Okay.
Yeah, David Grush.
Yeah, David Grush. Yeah, exactly. I mean, these guys are so convincing the way they say it, but when you really break down what they're saying, did you see it? Well, no, I didn't see it, but I know this guy who says he saw it. Well, who is the guy? Oh, I can't tell you. Okay, this is not helpful.
I'd love to come back to that at the end, but just if you don't mind, I'd love to stick with this interesting contrast between what has been very evolutionary effective, but yet in our modern era is a little problematic. You've covered patternicity. What about agencicity? Why is that dangerous when we assign agency to things? Obviously, it's great for survival. Where can we go?
Well, it is the basis of religion, the belief in gods, God or gods or spirits that are controlling things. That's kind of the older example. Conspiracy theories are very much in this vein. Now the problem is there are conspiracies. So show me who the conspirators were and I'll believe it. Otherwise, I think you're just impugning these patterns with intentional agency that isn't actually there. And, that's part of the problem. Also, just intention of people or institutions. I think life is much more random and contingent than we give it credit for. And we tend to think everything happens for a reason. It's like you'll hear this, accusations against Trump or against Biden. They want to destroy America or they want to destroy democracy. Actually, most politics is just messy and random. Most people can't get anything done. And so the stuff that happens just happens randomly. I was just writing about this for a chapter in my next book about, that joke about economists predicted 9 of the last 5 recessions. And there's been massive studies on this, like, a century's worth of economic upturns and downturns, recessions and depressions and so on in, like dozens of countries around the world by thousands of economists. And they really do no better than random chance at predicting when the next depression or recession is coming. They can't do it. Even with all the sophisticated models. I was just reading about this, another study done, Fragile Families database. This is like almost 5,000 families in the United States who are under the poverty level. So these are fragile families. They're divorced or single moms. They're in poverty. They're out of work. They live in tenement housing, foster homes. It's just It's kind of the hardest life you could have, right? And so they gave 160 teams of social scientists, and they could use all the sophisticated AI, statistical modeling, regression equations, everything they could find. Predict which children of which families are going to have the worst GPAs or the best GPAs, or graduate from high school or not, and so on. And they failed to predict. They could not. They did no better than random chance. Astonishingly, truly. I mean, this is a recent study with even AI, pretty sophisticated AI programs to help crunch the numbers of these massive data sets. I mean, millions of data points. You got 5,000 families, and they're measuring dozens and dozens of different factors, and still they can't predict. And I think a lot of life is like that. So I would take this idea and carry it even further. That is, social science has limitations. There's just certain things it will never know, because there's so many variables, and the contingency is so complex. And you get this, what Jorge Borgia called the garden of forking paths. You start down a path, you go right instead of left, you zigged instead of zagged. And then, 400 steps later, you're way down this pathway over here. How did you end up there? I don't know. And that's mostly random. I mean, there's certain variables: socioeconomic class, education, religion, age, gender, on where part of the country you're born in, with your parents' income, and all those are influencing factors. But there's a big mystery in social science that most people don't want to talk about, that came out with the behavior genetic studies on identical twins. Raised in the same home, raised in separate homes, siblings raised in the same home, siblings raised in separate homes, adopted children. So you have the whole matrix there of comparisons. But even with like everything being as close as possible, identical twins raised in the same home in which the parents tried their best to make them as identical as possible, they're still massively different from one another. And it's this, like kind of missing variables. What are they? And I think the answer is the 1,001 little things that each of these identical twins did that was slightly different than the other one. One was in the upper bunk and the other one was in the lower bunk. One of them joined this team and the other one started that sport. One of them had this teacher, the other one had a different teacher. And those little things that don't seem to make any difference at all can make a massive difference the further down the forking paths you go. And
in complexity theory, which we're covering in detail on this show, this series, both from a biological point of view and from a mathematical point of view with Stephen Wolfram, literally that tiny amount of randomness in the system very quickly multiplies exponentially. And, even, really advanced mathematics just can't do anything about it. And you just have to let go at that point. So really looking forward to getting Stephen Wolfram's point of view on this and really what we can actually model.
I really should add him. Has he written something on that, what you just said?
Absolutely. Yeah. And he,
what would you send me the link to that? I want to add this to my chapter.
Stephen Wolfram,
because he's very good on that.
He is, and he actually has an entire mathematical theory on that. So I'll send you the link to his writings on that.
Yeah. So here's the problem: is that the more variables you add to the equation of trying to make a prediction, the smaller your sample size is going to be. So if you just take if you tried to predict I'm about to turn 70 this year, what my annual income, lifetime earnings, and let's say wealth, overall net wealth is. If you tried to predict that, let's say 50 years ago, so, okay, well, he's a white male baby boomer raised in a middle-class family in California, and he graduated from high school barely, went to a community college, then he went to a four-year college, then he got a graduate degree, but then these bad things happen, but then these good things happen. And so the more you factor into the equation, pretty soon the sample size gets smaller and smaller until it's just me. You're just talking about me. That's it. Yeah. So I mean, you can say like all baby boomers that are age 70 in 2024 who were raised in a middle class, you can start the generalization, but the more and more factors you add, the smaller the group gets until pretty soon it's just me. And that's the problem I think social science has. It'll never be able to predict. You can post-dict after the fact. You can say, Well, you see these kids here, the reason they're in prison is because the broken homes, or they were raised in this crappy neighborhood, or they were exposed to environmental toxins, or they were running with gangs, whatever it is you're interested in studying. All that is part of the equation. Yeah. But if you start off and go, okay, here's 100 kids raised in the south side of Chicago in this port, which are the ones that are going to be in prison? That's not possible to know. So I don't think even with AI, you're ever going to get a minority report scenario where the government can predict based on these computer models who's going to commit crimes and who's not before they do it. Not possible. And this leads to this problem of, let's say mass public shooters, school shooters. What we got to do something about it. We got to get these kids mental health treatment when they need it ahead of time and so on. Not possible to know, which of the 1,000 kids who mumbled something about wanting to shoot up the school are actually going to do it. Most of them are not going to do anything. But, after the fact, we go, well, that's the one. We should have known, because look in his diary, he said, I'm going to shoot up the school. There's this court case going on right now. How come the mother didn't see that and do something? Because it's really hard to predict who's going to actually act on these things.
Now, last point, assigning meaning to life where perhaps there is none. Now, obviously, this has been very useful in evolution because it's grouped us together in sort of groups of similar points of view, similar understandings of meaning, and they hold each other in safe groups. Where does that break down when we come to the modern day?
Well, I guess we make a distinction between, some kind of objective meaning, like in the universe. Well, no such
Well,
thing.
you spoke about moral realism, so you obviously
I
believe
do
that there
think
is some.
I think there is some in the species itself. Like, what is the purpose of an organism? Well, we know from evolutionary theory, the purpose is to get its genes in the next generation. They got to survive and flourish, get enough calories, and so you get to the age at which you can reproduce. That's it. That's the purpose of life. Now, it's not that simple for more complex organisms who can have goals. So you have goals. So this is what we mean by, I guess, by rationality. Do you have goals at which you want to reason your way toward? Now, a single cell organism following a chemical gradient, toward, or following a light stream or something, that's a pretty simple goal, but it's a goal. So organisms have goals they're striving for. So in a way, the purpose of life is to strive to achieve goals. Now, do you have goals or don't you? Do you want something or do you not? I want food. I prefer to be satiated than starving. I'd prefer to be educated than ignorant, and so on and so on. And there's certain things you can do to get one and avoid the other. And that's the purpose of goal. Purpose of life is, well, as I say, it's, the second law of thermodynamics is the first law of life. Entropy is, the universe is just running down. It doesn't care about you. It doesn't care about anything. There's nothing caring. It's just the laws of physics. So the purpose of life is to push back against entropy. That is, carve out a little niche of order in the chaos. Just gather some calories every day and try to reproduce and so on. That's pushing back against entropy. Every city ever built, the purpose of a city is energy consumption, energy capture. That's what cities do. They capture energy. Yeah, and again, that's just second law stuff. Things are just running down. So the purpose of life is to, do something extropic, push back against entropy. Now, for humans, we have all kinds of things. We can do art and music and literature, and, add layers and layers and layers on top of meaningful goals. But, that this is like Maslow's pyramid of hierarchy, where, at the bottom, you got to, meet your basic needs. You got to have enough food to eat and 3 square meals a day and a roof over your head and so on. And then you want to find, a love, a meaningful relationship with somebody, and family, extended family, friends, a social community, and then purposeful goals, work, and, spirituality. And at the top, something that's higher than all of us. Well, that's how you build meaning and purpose in life. And some people get it from religion. That's fine. But you don't have to have that. You can get it from anywhere.
But why is teleology, this idea that there might be some meaningful reason for things to exist, some purpose of nature, why is it so hard to imagine? How do you come to the conclusion that we live in a meaningless universe?
Well, if you just think about the universe, I mean, it's just space and time and matter. what's the purpose of a
and
star?
consciousness and purpose and everything you
Well,
just spoke about.
consciousness, yeah.
It's that too, surely.
I mean, if there were no humans, would there be consciousness in the universe?
But there are
Or
humans.
or just just eliminate the Earth. There's no living organisms anywhere on Earth. Or just there's no Earth. Would there be consciousness in the universe? Let's say there's no aliens anywhere. It's nothing but planets and moons and comets and galaxies and so on.
But we
Would
just
there
spoke
be?
about life, and you were pretty clear that all of the stuff you just described on Maslow's triangle is very much associated with life and consciousness.
Yeah, that's right.
So it does
So you have to have.
exist. And there's a
To
high
me, you have to have.
probability there is life elsewhere. I think it may be unlikely that we ever find it, but it's very, very
Yes,
high probability.
I think so. Yes, I think so, but not inevitably so. It could
No,
be that
no,
there's
no.
none. Yeah, it's not inevitable. So I think there. Okay, this word teleology. Is there a goal directed? Well, in a way, I think the laws of nature lead to things moving from simple to complex. Not inevitably, but it just happens. Emergent properties, let's say. And once you move away from the left wall of simplicity, then you can get all kinds of complex systems and organisms and so on. And there's a kind of logic to why single cell organisms would collect into these multicellular organisms. There's theories about this, and then why multicellular organisms would coalesce into these larger bodies with organs and skin and brains and like us and so on. That may be a byproduct of the laws of nature without anybody directing this. It's a byproduct. It's unintended consequences. It's an invisible hand,
Sure,
whatever
but
metaphor you want to use.
how do you arrive at that conclusion? What's your reasoning to assume that?
Not assuming, there's no logic. It's just observations of nature, I would say. Just this is what evolutionary theory tells us happens.
That it's meaningless.
Well, let's not use that word because that word is loaded. It's just
Sorry, it's just it's
yeah,
this
I know
point from your book about belief that you're saying we're assigning meaning where perhaps there is none. And
oh, that's right. That's
I'm
right. We do
interested
that.
why
Yeah.
we necessarily have been the creators of that meaning, and
Oh, I
why
see.
there's
I
no
see. I
meaning
see.
behind the fact we've projected that. I'm interested how you can arrive to that conclusion rather than assuming, why can't that not be true?
Oh, well, I would go along with this again, this agencicity, or what Dan Dennett calls this hyperactive agency detector. That it pays to assume other things are intentional beings also. Oh, Dan
Mhm.
calls it the intentional stance. Assume that this other organism across from you has intentions. Yeah, even if it doesn't, it's going to act in a certain way that could have consequences for your survival and flourishing. Therefore, it's better to assume it has intention, meaning, purpose than not. And it's a kind of truth claim that's pragmatically true. Whether it really does or not is irrelevant. It matters what I think it does. And something like that, I would say, is the derivative of where we get this idea.
So basically, this idea that it's interesting. A physicist I spoke to said that he felt that consciousness was pushing back against entropy, exactly as you said, like trying to carve out this area of a lack of entropy in order to sort of survive. And it sounds like that's more or less where you and it sounds like you're a big fan of Dennet, the way Sue Blackmore is as well.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what about confirmation bias, which in the context of your book, Believing Brain, is our propensity to sort of unconsciously seek out data that confirms existing beliefs and avoid or just simply blank data that contradicts it? This is a very real danger, right? I mean, I wonder what might be the evolutionary reason for such a bias.
Well, the argument here, this is Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber's theory about the evolution of reason and rationality, is not veridical perception. That is, to make sure we get an absolutely accurate picture of the world, but rather to win arguments for our team. The
Right.
my side bias, motivated reasoning, confirmation bias, hindsight bias. All these heuristics are tools to help convince other people that we're right and ourselves. Self-deception is powerful.
Mm. Well, that was kind
And the
of the
reason
point
for that is what maybe group cohesion, kind of reciprocal altruism, I don't know, I guess, I got pro-sociality. These are the evolutionary forces at work here that, again, natural selection is not selecting you to have a perfect, high fidelity picture of the way the world really is. The evolution designed your perceptual system and brain to just survive long enough to get your genes into the next generation. That's it. So now that said, you have to get it reasonably right. You have to know that, that sharks do this and tigers do that. And this object there, is a cliff and you're going to fall off it. So you have to have some accurate perception of reality, but you don't need 100% high fidelity, perfect model of the world. And so given that, then you're going to make mistakes. But if they're not too costly, then it's not that bad to have it. Just take, like, back to the default to truth. Why are there cult leaders? Why are there scammers, freeloaders, bullies, and so on? How come natural selection to get rid of all these people that disrupt social cohesion? We're a social primate species. And the answer is because groups can survive pretty well with maybe 1% to 3% of the population being psychopaths, sociopaths, whatever, a little narcissistic, and so on. We don't have to weed out every last one of them.
And they keep us on our toes.
Yeah, well, there is an argument for that. To keep you on your toes. But it's like, so we have these different perceptual systems that work pretty well. How come natural selection didn't give us even better eyesight? Well, because it's not necessary. It's good enough. Why don't we have the eyesight of an eagle? That would be great. I'd love to have that kind of eyesight, because you don't really need it. It's what the eyesight we have is good enough. It's pretty impressive. And so you get this kind of what's called path dependency that, we've gone down this pathway like the QWERTY keyboard. We're all stuck with it now because that's the one we learned. There could be some better systems. Yeah. The Dvorak system, keyboard system, is supposed to be better than the QWERTY system, but not by that much. The QWERTY type, touch typing system works good enough to get the job done. And that's the story of evolution. Just it designed our bodies and brains and so on just to be good enough. And it's pretty impressive. But, why isn't it better? Because it would take a lot more energy to get even better. Natural selection has to make those. Why can't we live 200 years? Why do we have to, grow old and die and everything falls apart by your 80s, no matter what you do? Maybe 90s, maybe, with everything we know, we can get into the hundreds now, maybe. Why not 200? Why not 500? Because natural selection never saw the things that take out older humans in their 80s and 90s. And when I say didn't see it, all it's designed to see is that your genes get to the next generation. So maybe by your mid-20s. And maybe you need to live into your 40s or 50s so that your offspring are of reproductive age because they need support. So grandparenthood may be an evolutionary adaptation. But great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents, they're not adding much. They're not adding really much at all. So you don't need them. Now, I say this in an anthropomorphic way, like there's a natural selector out there thinking like, well, we don't really need grandparents. We're going to get rid of those great-grandparents. But it's just the byproduct of what it's like, why did we not evolve mechanisms to avoid Alzheimer's disease? This degeneration of the brain, because natural selection never saw Alzheimer's disease because almost no one ever lived into their 80s. And by the time you've had your offspring and your offspring have offspring, then Alzheimer's kicks in, or prostate cancer or whatever disease of old age. Your job is done. Evolution doesn't care about you anymore by that time.
So, Michael, there's one last point I want to introduce about the modern era, actually, rather than our sort of evolutionary history, before we get on to the slightly tricky subject of conspiracy, which is a subject of your new book. And that's this crucial point of algorithmic amplification, something we've seen in this sort of social media technological era. Now, we've already heard that we live with a brain that tells itself stories about the world, convinced that they're true rather than just best guesses, and that we tend to avoid information that contradicts those projected beliefs. And that cues artificial intelligence algorithms charged by the tech companies with maximizing engagement by prioritizing information that people will engage with rather than information that's fact checked. And then this clickbait drives the already artificially biased worldviews fed by this need for confirmation of belief, and it further exacerbates an already distorted information ecosystem. So add to that the way these internet platforms are then siloing those people with similar beliefs into these isolated echo chambers, and we have this perfect storm for a false information epidemic. Would you agree with that summary of this issue with algorithmic amplification and these echo chamber silos?
Yes, I do think this is a problem. I'm not convinced it's an existential problem.
No, it's just a tech problem as far as I'm concerned.
It's a tech problem. I think we're too early on to know really what the truth is about this. Social media is still relatively new. Facebook is just 2007. That's not the, Twitter 2000. It's not that
20
long
years.
ago.
20 years.
Not even 20 years. Yeah. So, I've been having guests on the show talk about this, this spike in teen depression, anxiety, cutting, suicidal ideation, so on. What is going on here? So social media is fingered as one of the causes. But, is it just screen time? Is it lack of outdoor time, socializing with other kids your age in person? There's some funny memes going around the other day of, look at this picture from 1995 of people at the beach. There's no phones. It's like, hey, everybody, we should try that again. And there's another one of a concert, like 1995 and 2024 of a concert. In 1995, everybody's just enjoying the concert. In 2025, every cell phone is up in the air filming the concert. It's like, yeah, that is wild. But is that a long-term trend and we should be concerned, or is this in 10 more years that'll all be gone? No one will be doing Facebook anymore. They'll be doing something else, and then we'll be off social media. We'll be doing this other thing, whatever that is. And that I don't know. It's hard to say. I think it's worth having the conversation. As you saw, Zuckerberg appeared at Congress the other day, having to explain himself, and behind him are these parents whose kids killed themselves because of social media. Like, oh boy. This is really coloring the conversation. I think the assumption is that we know for sure there's a causal connection there. There may be. It's not 100% convinced, although it's
Social science.
It's social science, but it's not. Yeah.
It's
Anyway,
not confirmed.
Yeah, it's not confirmed. Yeah. So I think it's possible, but again, and also perhaps these teens, when they're in their, say, late 20s, early 30s, they won't be doing any of that anymore because they'll be doing something else. And this was never a existential crisis. It could just be something we have to pay attention to. I don't know. We'll see.
Okay. So all of that science we just discussed feeds into your new book, Conspiracy Theory, Why Rational People Believe Irrational Things. So break it down for us, Michael. What's the main argument of the book? What else is there from cognitive science that we haven't yet mentioned that makes rational people bizarrely believe these irrational
Well, to start, because they don't think they're irrational beliefs. As I say, no one in the history of the world has ever joined a cult. They join a group that they think is going to be good. No one in the history of the world has ever self-identified as a pseudoscientist. They think they're scientists, and they've got this theory. They're not like, I have this pseudo theory. I'm going down to my pseudo lab and collect some pseudo facts to support my pseudo idea. No, and so, people that believe conspiracy theories, to them, they really are conspiracies. They've uncovered a true conspiracy. And in this case, as opposed to, say, the paranormal or the supernatural, there really are conspiracies. Conspiracies happen all the time. I give tons of examples in the book: the assassination of Lincoln, Watergate, the start of World War I with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand by the Serbian nationalist Black Hand cabal, the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Nazi attack on the Soviet Union. These are all secret conspiracies, conspiracy of corporations to cheat the regulatory state, like Big Pharma. When RFK Jr. talks about Big Pharma capturing the regulatory state, that's not a crazy conspiracy theory. It actually happened.
They fined millions every year.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it's true. They do this, and and that's a conspiracy. Or, the CIA trying to assassinate foreign leaders in the 60s and 70s. They did. They tried to assassinate Cuba's Castro dozens of times. So when somebody says, I have a conspiracy theory, the question is not, is he crazy? The question is, is a signal detection problem. Is it true or not? Because there are conspiracies. So a conspiracy theory is just an idea about a possible conspiracy. Whether it's true or not remains to be seen. Let's see the evidence and so on and so forth. So I try to demystify the word conspiracy, crazy conspiracy. Oh, he's just one of those crazy conspiracists. No, I think, there's a kind of rationality behind assuming that there are more conspiracies than there are, just in case. It's the same thing with the signal detection problem with the homida on the plains of Africa, and here the rustle in the grass, dangerous predator, just the wind. Is there really a conspiracy or not? Well, your assumption makes a difference, could make a difference in your life. Maybe it's better to assume there is, just in case, even if there isn't, and so on. So that's kind of the overall logic. It's a kind of a game theory analysis of conspiracy theories. Then I break it down: proxy conspiracism, tribal conspiracism, and this kind of paranoid or constructive conspiracism, along the lines of what I just said. So for tribal conspiracism, this is the kind of conspiracy that's part of our tribe. Back to reasoning to support your tribe, is like the MAGA Republicans think the election was stolen. Well, 99% of these guys have no idea what actually happened, because most of us don't know how to fact check an election, but there are people that do. And so that's how we can get at the truth about whether an election was rigged or not. But for MAGA Republicans, Trump supporters, that's secondary. Really, it's more of a tribal thing. Everybody in my tribe says this is true, so I'm just going to go along with it. In a proxy conspiracism, it's something similar, but that the conspiracy theory is a stand-in, a proxy for something else. My type specimen there is the Pizzagate, in which Hillary and the Democrats are accused of running this pedophile ring out of a pizzeria in Washington, D.C. So do people really believe that? Because pollsters tell us some non-trivial percentage of people think there's something to this conspiracy theory. Well, one guy really believed it, Edgar Welch. He went there with his gun to break up the pedophile ring at the Comet Ping Pong Pizzeria in Washington, D.C., and he was quite surprised to find there was no basement there where the pedophile ring was going on. In fact, nobody was doing anything other than eating pizza. And but my contention is most people don't believe that in the same way they believe something else that's really true or not. This is a stand-in. Like, I don't know whether Hillary really did that or not, but it's the kind of thing she would do, right? Those Democrats, I don't like them. I don't trust them. Maybe the Pizzagate thing is not real, but I know they're up to something no good. Therefore, I don't like them. In the same way that if I convinced you that Pizzagate was not true, would you then vote for Hillary instead of Trump? Just go back to 2016. No, these people are never going to vote for Hillary. That's why we think that the Russian interference through the bots and social media probably wasn't that influential on the 2016 election, because people were pretty much decided, this is true for most political elections, already ahead of time. In fact, it doesn't even really matter who the candidate is. Like, I'm a Democrat. I'm whoever it is. I hope it's my guy, but if it's the other guy, I'll vote for him anyway. And that's how I think most Republicans, except for these never Trump Republicans, but most Republicans, lots of them I know, say, yeah, I don't really like Trump, but he's my guy. Who am I going to vote for? The Democrat? No way. Right. So a lot of it is, I think, tribal, it's proxy, as well as this kind of constructive conspiracism where, just in case it could be dangerous. So that's my theory behind conspiracy.
And what about the sort of paranoid side? Is there some sense in which we also have unbelieving brains here? I mean, in the sense of being overly suspicious. I mean, we have an excellent episode on the psychology of our innate negativity bias, if anyone's interested in this theme, left over from harder times in our earlier evolution. Some commentators have even gone so far as to say that those who've suffered from trauma or abuse are more liable to suspect conspiracies from those in power. Is there any evidence that at least a portion of us are innately suspicious and unbelieving that might lead us to believe some of these more
certainly, yes. Well, and not just people who've experienced trauma, but anybody that, like victims of an earthquake, or if there's a economic downturn and companies let employees go, there's often rampant conspiracy theories about what's really going on behind the scenes that's separate from this other thing that they said it was. That's pretty normal. The negativity bias, I'm glad you brought that up. It's a huge factor. I have a whole section on it in my book on this, that bad is stronger than good, as the title of the famous paper by Roy
Roy
Baumeister.
Yeah.
Yeah, strong is better. Well, why is that? Okay, there's an evolutionary logic behind it. Back to what we were talking about, signal detection, and what's the worst kind of error to make, type 1 or type 2? Well, one of them is more dangerous. If you're not paranoid enough, you could take yourself out of the gene pool. So there's a kind of a logic to being at least moderately paranoid, just in case. Again, the universe doesn't care about you. Bad things happen. Entropy just takes its course. There's just far more ways for things to go wrong than to go right. Pretty much most days, right? So it's good to be, attentive. Pay attention when you get in the car. Don't space out, because you never know. Bad things do happen. Not all the time, but just enough. So evolution designed us to care more about negative things than positive things for a very good reason. If you just, think about, well, like economic, what's called loss aversion in behavioral economics, loss aversion, where losses hurt twice as much as gains feel good. Okay, I just repeat that. Losses hurt twice as much as gains feel good. So research shows that to get somebody to give up something they already have, you have to pay like twice what they had paid for it originally. Or if you want somebody to make an investment in some stock or whatever, the potential payoff has to be twice what the loss would hurt for the person. And so there's a good reason for that. Again, because losses are, make risk aversion is a good evolutionary strategy for getting your genes in the next generation. There's just so many ways you cannot get there that it pays to be a little more on the paranoid side.
Roy's research also brought out that we're more interested in making sure people don't think that we're useless and bad than we are in being famous for being useful and great, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, I have a story from Jared Diamond, who's a good friend of mine, that he goes to Papua New Guinea every summer for his research, first on birds, and then now he does anthropology stuff. But he talks about, when he's there, they sleep out in tents, just out in the woods. And he first started pitching his tent under big trees. It's a little more protective or whatever. And his Papua New Guinean friends are going, this is a bad idea. You got to pitch your tent out there in the open. Well, why? Well, because the tree might fall and kill you. It's like, well, what are the chances of that? Like 1 in 1,000. And then he realized, well, I'm out here, hundreds of nights every few years, and in the course of a decade, I'll be dead. If it's only 1 out of 1,000, it's gonna get me. So again, these are low odds but high consequences. So it pays to pay attention to those things, the negative things, more than the positive things. There's just so many ways for your body to particularly as you get older, to go wrong. It's just 100 different things that could take you out. So you have to be kind of paranoid about it. And, I've been thinking more and more about that now that I'm going to turn 70 this year. It's like, oh, I better start paying attention here to the things that could take me out and do something about it now. But that's not really paranoia. That's kind of, there's a rationality behind that.
Mm. I want to come back for a moment to what you mentioned about there being some true conspiracies, because I got a couple of concerns about this whole conspiracy situation that I want to run past you. So you mentioned in the book the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand that triggered the First World War. You mentioned some other great examples. Other good examples that came to mind for me were the Iran-Contra during Reagan's presidency, involving the sale of arms to Iran during the embargo. Iraq War evidence of weapons of mass destruction with Colin Powell waving anthrax in the UN. I mean, come on. More recently, we've had the Edward Snowden revelations, Chelsea Manning, really massive scoops, a lot of them coming from WikiLeaks, culminating with these Hillary Clinton emails. You mentioned the Cambridge Analytica, Trump Bannon, social media election influencing scandal. The list really is very long of real ones. But despite these really brave journalistic scoops, trust in the legacy media stories is at an all-time low. And trust in amateur journalists researching on the internet is at an all-time high. And to add even more difficulty to this situation, we now know more about misinformation techniques from intelligence agencies like spreading false stories to seed mistrust in the enemy's general public, as we saw with in the early 1980s with the Russian KGB diffusing the conspiracy theory that the HIV virus was man-made. It was originally seeded in India before it sort of naturally spread to the West, where it was originally intended to do the damage. As a friend of mine who's a diplomat said, they do it, we do it. It's just the way it works. I was so sad when he said that. So, Michael, given this ever greater informational overload, this chronic distrust in institutional news wires, disinformation, counter disinformation, this algorithmic amplification, clickbait issues we were discussing before, what tools, and you mentioned reason so many times so far, what tools are you suggesting for young people coming into this, digital natives? You know, they've grown up in this sea of conflicting information and clickbait. What tools are you recommending to help us to disclude false conspiracies without throwing the baby out with the bathwater?
Yeah, you can't do that. You know, those so-called legacy media, mainstream media, lamestream media, as some other might call it. This is overblown. I mean, for the most part, most of the reporting done in regular stories in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, say Washington Post, they're all pretty much the same. You know, if you read just the regular stories about on the front page and so on, it's the op-ed sections that are so different. Okay, but right there, it's their opinion. And you know, when you read the New York Times, you're going to get more left-leaning opinions. And you read the Wall Street Journal, you're going to get more right-leaning opinions and more left on the Washington Post and so on. And so I don't throw the mainstream media out. I mean, most of the, you know, the good sources, the major networks, BBC and so on, most of the reporting is pretty good. Independent journalism, I admire that. I think that's a good addition. Although, again, you have to be careful, you know, who you're reading and know what their background is and do they have some kind of agenda. Sometimes it's right up.
Michael? What are the tools?
How do you do that? Well, you just Google a person. Who is this guy? And oh, he works for this right-wing think tank. Okay, that doesn't automatically discount everything the person says, but you just have to know it may be coming with a particular agenda. You know, like the Daily Wire. You know, Ben Shapiro and Matt Welsh and these guys. I enjoy their reporting and I watch it sometimes, but I don't just take it with a grain of salt because I know these guys are conservatives and they're openly conservative. We are giving you a conservative perspective on the news. Okay, fair enough. Same thing with Fox News. I'm going to get this other thing. I go to MSNBC and Rachel Maddow. I know I'm going to get a left-leaning progressive view. Okay, at least that's up front. The harder ones are the ones that you don't know, who kind of hide their agenda. And so you have to be careful and just, I don't know, it's kind of cliche to say, you know, fact check it before. How would I do that? Well, you know, I don't know. Sometimes before I retweet things, I'll actually look the person up. You know, there'll be some story about something I'm agitated about. I'm like, oh, here's another one. I'm going to retweet this. Wait a minute. I never heard it. Who is this guy? So I'll look him up and go, oh, well, he might be right, but he's this crazy right winger or left winger. So I'm going to.
Exactly. Lucky you didn't tweet that when you're in the mood. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the problem with social media. You feel like you have to comment on everything, and you don't. You know, you don't have to comment on you don't have to have an opinion about everything. And, you know, that's part of the problem.
So you agree that more voices is better for freedom of thinking.
Oh, absolutely.
Doesn't that mean that young people need more common sense in order to sort of wade through the vast quantity?
I would like to see more classes on critical thinking, really critical thinking, like my course, Skepticism 101. This is my course. I've been teaching it for 12 years at Chapman University. I'm not teaching that anymore because I live too far away now. But I just recorded the course for Jordan Peterson's Academy, the Peterson Academy, which they're going to release this month, February 2024, along with a bunch of other courses. And that anybody could see my course now. I mean, millions of people can take my course rather than the 25 students I usually get. And just more of that, how to think about any claim made. How do you know that's true? I tweeted one yesterday that was going around of this, I think it was a high school teacher, college teacher, and one of his students was agitated about a J.K. Rowling tweet about trans. Oh, she's transphobe. Oh, really? Well, read me the tweet. So he reads the tweet and the teacher's like, well, what's transphobic about that? And this conversation goes on for like 3 or 4 minutes. And it's just a beautiful example of not challenging or threatening anybody, just asking questions. Like, what is it exactly you think is, what do you mean by transphobe? And why would that sentence right there be transphobic? Just tell me. And you can't see the student, you just hear him in the background. And you hear his wheels turning like, oh, huh. Actually, you know what? I don't know. Somebody told me that that was transphobe, but now that I read it, I'm not sure it is. It's like, okay. And you just kind of see it in just like 3 minutes. It's astonishing. And that's
But
not hard to do. This isn't quantum physics we're teaching kids, right? It's just,
But by the time you've managed to get the student to think about that, it's already been reposted 50 times. It's got
yes,
50
yeah.
comments on each one, and the algorithms have picked it up and it's going out there.
I know the research on that, the kinds of words that are used in a tweet make it more or less retweetable. And the more agitated, emotionally charged
Yeah.
words. Yeah,
The
I know.
Facebook scandal that they were prioritizing 8 times more negative posts because it maximized engagement.
Yeah, I know. I know. Well, so there you have an incentive, economic incentive mismatch
Right.
between what we would like as a society in a free, open discussion and what motivates a for-profit company. Well, you can see what the conflict is there. And you saw Zuckerberg in front of Congress trying to explain this not well.
How did he justify
Uh,
it? I
oh
haven't
well,
seen.
he said there's no evidence that any of this hurts anybody. And I saw Jonathan Haidt posting things. Oh no, yeah, you're wrong about that. Here's the research. Boom, boom, boom. Okay, so that's how to do it. I have an open conversation about this. Um, but his incentive, of course, is shareholder value rather than what it should be, which is stakeholder value, which is everybody, not just your stockholders, but the users, employees, the
Yeah.
neighborhood your company is in, the whole everything. And this here, I make the case that that sounds like a progressive idea, but in fact, John Mackey, who's a friend of mine, he's the CEO of Whole Foods, and he sold it to Amazon. But John is, he's a gazillionaire. He's a libertarian, free market guy, big capitalism, Ayn Rand fan, and so on. But, he wrote a book called Conscious Capitalism. He said, actually, we'll make more money and it's better for our company
Mm.
if we have a restriction on how much more the CEO can make than the average worker. He put it at 19 times, as opposed to these other companies where it's like 500 times more than the average worker pay that the CEO makes. And we should take care of our employees, make sure that so that they don't have to unionize because we have such great benefits and healthcare and everything. They don't need to unionize, and we should take care of the neighborhood in which our store is located. That we have all this food left over at the end of the day. Let's give it to these shelters and take care of these people. So his argument is not that this is a nice liberal progressive thing to do, which sounds kind of squishy, but it's more like this is a good capitalist thing to do because
Mm.
it's not just our stockholders, it's our stakeholders, our employees, our customers, the people that are in the neighborhood where the store is located. And so all of that in society, all that matters. And I think that's the approach to take.
Yeah, I've been arguing that for years. Listen, there's one more thing here before I've just got a few questions, classic kind of get the skeptics views questions at the end. I've got one more really worrying concern about the conspiracy situation I want to get your take on. So talking about throwing the baby out with the bathwater, the other concern that I wanted to find out about is this pejorative use of the term conspiracy theorist. Now, I grew up on the left, sounds like you did too, in the late 80s and during the 90s, suspicious of corporate power, watching on the news this long list of examples of lobbying from the likes of tobacco, big food companies, oil companies, and how they just used to buy the government's acceptance of some pretty spurious science with nice fat campaign contributions. It's capitalism 101, basically. And that leftist skepticism of corporate corruption is now tagged as conspiracy theorist and therefore associated with other pejorative terms like far right, like Trumpist. And this reversal of the narrative over the last 20 years is just
Mm-hmm.
mind boggling for left wing activists. And it's all the more confusing given this extraordinary increase in government debt. So basically, they've become less powerful on the one hand, and an even more unequal distribution of wealth towards the larger corporations on the other hand. Don't you think that this amplifying of conspiracy theorist nutcase meme we risk a further stigmatization
Hmm.
of the journalists willing to risk their careers and their reputation reporting on controversial subjects like corporate lobbies' influence in fields like food, health, banking, defense, you know, these kind of examples. How do we continue to encourage this brave, truth-seeking journalism in the vein of the moral science you started to speak about at the beginning of the interview, in the face of such sort of unnuanced black and white tagging cancel culture?
Yeah, there's a lot there. So first of all, I was never on the left or liberal. I was libertarian. So I was equally critical of not just government intrusion in business, but crony capitalism. That most of these corporations are doing what we used to be called rent seeking. That is, they're trying to gain an unfair advantage over their competitors by getting the government to do their bidding for them. Through tariffs and unfair competition and special favors from the government and so on. That's not free market capitalism. That's crony capitalism, and I've always been as critical of that. So it never surprised me to read these stories again, like big pharma trying to capture the regulatory state. That's how capitalism actually works in America. And I'm equally critical of that as I am, the other side, criticizing the government for being too intrusive in the marketplace. We need some regulations. After 2008 and the whole meltdown, financial meltdown that happened there, was around the same time that in my sport of cycling, it became clear that everybody was doping in the sport. And so I wrote a big piece for Scientific American on the kind of behavioral game logic behind doping in sports. Even if no one wants to dope, if you think somebody's doping, then you have to dope out of necessity because it makes a big advantage. And the difference between, it could be 0.1% difference in performance or 1%. And these were like 10% different drugs that made a difference. 10%. It's a huge, huge performance enhancement. So, there's kind of a system of problem there, collective action problem, as they're called, in which you need a top-down governing body or government or somebody to say, this is the rule that we're going to impose now, like helmets in cycling. No one likes to wear a helmet. It's nice to have just cruise along with the wind blowing through your hair, what little I have left. And but I know it's good to wear a helmet. Thank God. I had a massive crash a couple of months ago in which I smacked my head into the pavement and broke my helmet. I'd have been in the hospital, probably brain damaged if I hadn't had my helmet. So it's good to wear a helmet. No one wants to wear a helmet. So how do you get people to do it? Because the moment the other guys aren't doing it, you don't want to do it either, and so on. So you just have to have a governing body that says, this is it. This is what we're doing, whether you like it or not, everybody, 100%. And the doping thing is the same way. So then I started looking at Wall Street and the trades, and the traders and these default loans and these credit default swaps and all those weird financial instruments that almost none of us knew anything about till that came out. They're doing what? They're bundling these crappy mortgages and selling them for even more, and they're even worth even less when they're bundled, and they pay even more. What? And then you read it and go, how did this happen? And there was no conspiracy of like one person. It was just everybody doing it because everybody else was doing it. And you can picture the one little guy in the office, and his boss comes in and says, all right, you got to close this many mortgages this month. That's your goal. And otherwise we're going to hire somebody else. Okay, what am I going to do? I'm going to do what everybody else is doing. And then you just ratchet that up to thousands of these people doing it. And then you get this collapse. And so there, I kind of moderated my libertarian free market ideas that, I think we do need some government regulation here. Not that the people are bad, but that the incentives are mismatched from what we actually want. Because we don't want people cheating like that. We don't want, we have insider trading laws for a reason, because people do this all the time. They really do. It's
Wouldn't
astonishing.
you if it was legal? Wouldn't you? I would if I was a banker.
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's the incentive. So, yeah. So I think, a lot of that, again, back to conspiracies, that like Volkswagen cheating the emission standards, big pharma capturing the regulatory. Yeah, this happens. And we have to, smack down hard on that. And that's why it's hard to get opioids now for pain. A lot of chronic pain patients have a hard time getting their prescriptions refilled because there's so many hurdles now that the state has imposed, but for good reason, right? Because it was abused.
But those critics of big corporations are now being called conspiracy theorist nuts, and you're far
I
right.
know they shouldn't. That's my point in my book. It's not a stigma because it really happens. I mean, we have to be realistic about this. You're naive if you think corporations are not trying to gain an unfair advantage over other corporations in their industry. Happens all the time.
So how do we stop this shaming that's happening on social media of anybody who calls this out? A whole bunch of, what I guess are called normies in the meme speak, a whole bunch of normies piling on them going, oh, you just believe anything you see on YouTube.
Yeah, I don't know how to do it. There's a lot of different theories about this. I have liked the new Twitter X notes that they've added where people make comments, and I've been reading those last few weeks. It's like they're really helpful. I don't know if you've seen those where somebody posts something about immigration or whatever, and you'll see half a dozen comments, and it's like, oh, so this original tweet is not really as accurate as I thought it was because here's this guy correcting this little thing in it. I think maybe that's helpful. So I think Elon, that was good that he did that, or whoever his engineers designed that. And I think more of that is good. Fact checking is always good. But the norms of fact checking and that you might be wrong, has to be reinforced constantly in science, in the legal system, in journalism, social media, that we get it wrong a lot more than we think. And so therefore we need these norms of open dialogue, free speech, critical commentary, and so on. And that's what's been eroding because, this is the basis of cancel culture, is that we already know the truth. So we're going to cancel you if you don't repeat what we believe.
If you don't mind, there's just literally three last little points, and they're going to be little because the bulk of our conversation has been about that, listeners. But because Michael's just such a hugely experienced skeptic, there's three things I just want to get a few comments from him. So just bear with us for a little while here, guys. The first thing I want to get your view on is this really, really important theme of reductionism, which we touched on earlier with this idea of being a materialist. Now, many physicists and more neuroscientists are starting to see this traditional scientific reductionism of the world's phenomena to ever smaller units of physical division causing the higher level phenomena. You mentioned the word epiphenomena through this interaction, and they're seeing that as an oversimplification. Cognitive scientist John Vervaeke said in the last episode just before Christmas that he loves Evan Thompson's deep continuity hypothesis, in which we're sort of forced to accept that higher level phenomena emerging up from the smaller levels of interaction are equally important as higher level phenomena emanating down to these lower levels in a sort of what they call a deep continuity. And regarding this upward downward causality idea, which I think sort of, materialists would say is just all upward, it's not downward. Neuroscientist Anil Seth explained that as far as he's concerned, it's not only upwards and downward causation, but causation firing in all different directions, which I love this.
Yeah.
It's very neuroscientific, up, down, left, right, in every single direction, a genuine integrated network of interconnected causation. Michael, are you a reductionist? Has your point of view of reductionism and materialism altered over the years with the emerging neuroscience and physics research?
Well, I'm an emergentist for sure. Everything.
Emergentist.
Yeah, everything you just said is absolutely true. Well, it's just, emergent properties are real. I mean,
Definitely.
It's like, these determinist people I have on the show, and it's like it all reduces down to the neurons. That's it. You don't have any free will. You're determined by the neurons in your brain and the genetic wiring and the environment and so on and so forth. It's like, okay, that's a good reductionist argument. Where is, let's say, unemployment to be found in the neurons? And it's like, what? It's like unemployment. It's a real phenomenon. Economists study it. Politicians have to deal with it. It affects all of us. It's a hugely important thing. Where is that? It's nowhere, right? I mean, the entire economy, everything in economics, which is a good science, it has nothing to do with just neurons. You're not going to find it in the quantum equations of subatomic particles in in the synaptic gaps between neurons. It's not there. Right? And most of life, most of the stuff we care about is not at the reduction level. It's just not. You're not going to find it in physics. You have to go to a different science, and those are real phenomena. Pretty much most psychological states we talk about. Where's depression? Well, you can look for it in the neurons, but we've been doing that for half a century, and trying SSRIs and so on, and we're still missing a lot there because most of this is emergent. So I'm an emergentist, and I mean,
But
reductionism works really well for a lot of things, but it's not everything. It's not enough.
But Sue Blackmore, who if I understand you highly respect, she made this interesting point about the problem with dualism, and she was saying if you say it's emergent, whether we're talking about life emerging out of non-life or consciousness emerging out of non-consciousness, you're suggesting that in some sense it's separate. How do you
Yeah, I know it
confront this
sounds like
problem
that.
of emerging? I find this
Yeah,
emergence
yeah.
problem really problematic if you're a monist.
I know, because it sounds like you're saying, and then a miracle happens. When you
Well,
get 1,000,001 neurons, and then a miracle happens. The
well,
lights
and
come
that
on.
sounds like magic, which is everything you're
It
pushing
does.
back against.
I know. That's what it sounds like. But maybe the silly analogy, that one that's always used of, what is water, hydrogen and oxygen. Well, at what point does it become, a drop of water or a bucket of water or an ocean of water?
That's just weird.
It's the problem of the what's a hill, the heap problem. How many grains of sand does it take to make a heap? Well, then this becomes a conceptual language problem. What do you mean by a heap? What do you mean by free will or volition or choice? What do you mean
Sure,
by
but it's
consciousness?
clearly different. What the difference between life and not life is a bit
Yes,
different.
well, okay, but let's say the difference between a snail that has 60,000 neurons. Well, let's just take a C. elegans that has 302 neurons. Snail has 60,000 neurons. I forget
Where
the
do you
next
draw
one
the
up.
line? No,
Has like 100,000 neurons, 1,000,000 neurons, 10 million neurons, 85 billion neurons in our case. When do the lights come on? Well, it's think of it not a light switch, but a rheostat. It's just coming on a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. And then, maybe there's layers on top of layers on top of layers of neural networks that kind of map the whole body, so that, there's some layer of neural networks that are aware of all the other neural networks that represent my toes and my feet and my thighs and all the way up in my fingers and so on. And then at some point, there's a map of all the other maps, and that's myself, something like that. I mean, this is an actual theory about this.
Okay, next classic skeptic area, something we've touched on already. We've been covering it on the show. There's this long history of psi research, traditionally ridiculed by conventional science, and yet secretly investigated by many professional scientists.
Mm-hmm.
Curious to understand this very obviously anecdotal evidence out there in the public. I think most famously was Bob Jahn, the dean of engineering at Princeton, famously set up the Pear Labs at Princeton to his colleagues' chagrin. And as physicist Garrett Medell said here on the show, he came to the data kicking and screaming, but after he was just completely unable to disprove the results with his own experiments, and having studied the literature in detail, he just had to take his hat off and to this large body and just understand that it supported the effect. And I know.
Well, what does Sue Blackmore say about that?
No, well, yes, Sue obviously disagrees. But ex-Bell Labs and Princeton psychologist Dean Radin
I know about that. Yeah.
spoke of slowly, I'm sure he's been on your show, slowly
No.
ironing out the skeptics' objections of experiments over his really long career until they were pretty much watertight and there was no more criticisms on the experimental setup. And he spoke on the show of all these meta studies that are now being put together from all these labs showing all these various effects, precognition and telepathy. But it's the data on remote viewing at the Stanford Research Institute that I wanted to just get your opinion on quickly, Michael, because I know it's been in the news recently, particularly since this documentary, Third Eye Spies, which follows the physicist Russell Targ, who was employed by the US government to investigate psi phenomena in the 70s, after it was learned that Russia were working on such a program during the Cold War with supposedly successful results. So after they got some positive results in the early days, this it became the Stargate project, went top secret. And then they operated this psychic spy unit for more than 20 years with all of the three-letter agencies. And then, the declassification of this data for the documentary brought it back into the public eye. And what I wanted to ask you about was this: the program was shut down after an investigation into the efficacy of the method. After I think it was outed by Ed May, the director of the Stargate program, on the TV. And so the CIA were a little embarrassed, and they commissioned a report, and they included the report data from the respected professor of statistics at the University of California, Jessica Utts, and the famous skeptic psychologist Ray Hyman. Jessica Utts' report confirmed the statistical significance of the results and the scientific method, but was strangely eclipsed in the final CIA review by Hyman's report. And the final recommendation concluded this quote: "Even though a statistically significant effect has been observed in the laboratory, it remains unclear whether the existence of a paranormal phenomena, remote viewing, has been demonstrated.
Mm-hmm.
The laboratory studies do not provide evidence regarding the origin or nature of the phenomenon, assuming it exists." Now, Utts responded immediately, vociferously, to Hyman's report, saying she didn't agree, and she felt that her evidence in this review of two professional scientists had been downplayed. And this is what I wanted to ask you about, Michael. It's just because you mentioned that great example earlier. It's such a remarkable example and very public example of the showdown between skeptics and sci researchers, which has been going on for decades. Regarding these reports, that the lab experiments didn't provide evidence regarding the origin or nature of the phenomena, a point which, to my mind, is totally separate from the line of questioning proving its existence. My question to you, Michael, does it seem scientific to you of Hyman to acknowledge the significant result supporting the existence of the phenomena, only to dismiss the evidence because we can't explain its origin or nature?
Yes, it is, because we know that the scientific method is not enough by itself to account for all these anomalous experiences, which may represent, or experiments, which may or may not represent anything real. So, okay, that was a long tee up there. So let me just comment generally on a bunch of different things you brought up.
Because I know you've worked
So first of all, the
years.
Jessica Utts and Ray Hyman back and forth was really great. It was just a good example of how this kind of thing should be done. Yep, should be done. And the same thing happened after that with the Daryl Bem experiment on backward causality. This was the great Daryl Bem, who's a highly respected social scientist who published in a highly respected journal, Social Personality Psychology. So it's peer reviewed, in a real lab with, real experiments and so on. And, he found something rather shocking, that basically 400 years of physics and everything we understand about how the universe works is wrong. And that time can be, causality can be backwards. And that, these subjects he set up, let me just cue it up for your listeners, that, they're sitting before a computer screen, which is split. And there's an image that's going to pop up on one side of the screen or the other. The computer is going to randomly assign which left or right and which photo, a emotionally neutral image or an erotic image. And then the subjects had to guess, or which image is going to come up and so on. And, he found that it was, slightly more than 50%, which is what you'd get by a random coin flip model, statistically significantly more likely that the emotionally erotic image would be predicted than the neutral image. And so this was published in 2010 or 2009. And then Ray Hyman and others, went back and forth in the same journal that was in had a critique of the research methodologies. And then Ray Hyman and others, including myself and Scientific American, criticized the methodologies and so on. But that experiment actually launched the entire replication crisis problem in the social sciences and then the medical sciences. Because the question is, how is it that this obviously flawed experiment. You can, here's the half dozen problems. I summarize them in my in my book, and Ray Hyman does as well, and others. How did that get published? and not only that one, but when you started looking at hundreds of the most famous psychology experiments in history, probably over half, maybe 2/3, are not replicable. They should have probably never been published. How did this happen? And it turns out there are some deep flaws in the whole statistical significance testing protocols, p hacking. You got to get this 0.05 or 0.01 level of significance. And there's ways to do that by manipulating the data. You throw out the extreme data points that throw it off, or you do this, you do that, you massage the data. The file drawer problem, you run 9 experiments and you only report the 2 that were significant. We don't even know about the 7 that were not significant. So there's a bunch of protocols that have now been put in place to correct for those problems. So that's how science is self-correcting in that sense. Now, the Project Stargate, why is that no longer in service? If it worked, why wouldn't the CIA want to continue using it? They'll use anything they can to get intelligence. AI programs and better computers, and we pay off people in foreign countries to give us intel, and so this rich history of this. They'll do anything they can. They shut it down because it didn't work. That's why. If they could really remotely view where Osama bin Laden is, what cave is he in? Tell us. And it was never anything like that, ever. They just never came up with any useful intelligence that could be used in the future. Like, okay, this is the guy right there. He's 95% accurate or something. Let's put him on the case. Let's let him tell us where Osama bin Laden
At
is.
Price, Joe McGonigal, you ever see their data?
They sent me their 2-volume. It's like 1,000 pages. Yes, I've kind of scanned through it. I haven't read every page of the book. I know they claim that they did get some hits.
They were just pretty talented. Nobody's 100%. I mean, it's definitely.
Yeah, I know this is Michael Jordan used to miss shots too. Yeah, okay, but again, Sue Blackmore makes this point. We've been hearing these claims since the 1890s, and if it was true, wouldn't it be clear by now? A century and a half of rigorous protocols of good scientific testing, the Zener cards and all that stuff. I'm not talking about the TV psychics and all that bullshit, but the people that really want to get to the core of it. How come it's always just out of our reach? We can't quite get an obvious finding there that's clear and unmistakable, like Bigfoot, Loch Ness. Show us the body. Why, it's always just right on the liminal stage there. And even that liminal, it's like, maybe it's such an ephemeral phenomenon, just barely works. And if you have any other variables that interfere with it, the effect goes away. Okay. But again, Wall Street traders will do anything they can to get an advantage over other traders, right? I mean, there were stories about companies that moved their computers closer to where the trading floor was by like half a mile, so that the electronic trades they're making arrive at like 1/100th of a second sooner than the other guy who's on the other side of the river in New Jersey or something, right? Just any tiny bit, even just like 0.001% difference. When you make millions of trades a day, and so on in the course of months and years, you're going to make millions of dollars more than you would have if psychics could really do this, or whoever, remote viewers, anybody could really tell us just a 1.01% better than randomness of which stocks are going to go up and down. Then you could test this. Just take Tesla. Tesla stock goes way up and down. It's like 10% up and down every day. It's crazy. This would be obvious. If somebody could do that just slightly better, they would be super wealthy. I mean, it would be obviously true, and it's not. No one has been able to do that. The best stock, I would never give a broker any money because they can't do it. We know with in the hindsight bias, you can take the 6,000 hedge fund managers and look at the ones that beat the market every year for a decade, but not into the future. Here's the 6,000. Pick the one that's going to beat the market, the S&P 500 for the next 10 years. Which one? Beats me. Nobody knows. Back to where we were talking about earlier. I don't think it's possible to know that. So I think that's my thoughts on this. Again, it's not 100% that it can't be true, but it would be surprising if it turned out to be true and no one was able to take advantage of this or use it in any useful way. And it's always on this kind of fringe and margins of science, just barely, maybe, sort of, kind of, possibly, but not quite.
Well, you've already mentioned this replication crisis in the social sciences in general. So something as intuitive and subjective as those kind of impressions that are coming completely out of a free association of consciousness are definitely going to be almost impossible for the scientific method to deal with.
Yeah, and we don't have to pick on the psychics. I mean, just all these social science experiments in which if you have a clean desktop on your computer, you donate more money, or I forget what some of them are. If you like the top of the escalator versus the bottom of the escalator, you give more money to somebody asking for a donation, or you put the pen in your mouth this way versus this way, and you find a joke funnier, or you give somebody a warm cup of water versus a cold cup of water, and they'll assess that person as a warm or a cold personality. None of these replicated. Amy Cuddy's power pose, you put your shoulders back and your chin up and you ask for the rate. This increases testosterone and this is a good thing. This is all bullshit. It never replicated.
It may well be just completely out of the field of scientific method, mightn't it?
Well, so here's the take-home story is that don't believe a single experiment, no matter how good it is or who did the experiment, what lab it was in, what journal it was published in. If it's just one experiment, wait for it to be replicated a lot before you write the book or you hold the press conference or you give the TED Talk.
So look out, listeners. In this series, we've got a show on this, the physics of retrocausation, all this stuff on the relativity of time and the John Wheeler delayed choice experiments, these variations on the double slit experiment. There's going to be a really, really interesting show on that, this time symmetry question in physics, which I'm really interested to find out more about. Now, another theme that has received constant ridicule from skeptics, we've already touched on, is over 70 years of the UFO experience. And I promise I will let you go after this, Michael. It all started with the famous Roswell incident of 1947, still unconfirmed after government denials, and the surprisingly less famous 1952 mass sightings of an entire squadron of UFOs on radar by the military and by the local population and law enforcement over Washington's Capitol Hill and the White House, including Truman himself, who demanded an explanation, which was covered in 350 newspapers, including Time magazine. So that must have been really hard for the skeptics to refute. But since then, the stigma and the ridicule has just kept the mainstream press hesitant to cover this until late 2017, when the New York Times broke the story of the United States Nimitz, the USS Nimitz Tic Tac incident, witnessed by multiple pilots and radar operators, and revealing the Pentagon's top secret advanced aerospace threat identification program, which wasn't supposed to exist. It had been denied that they were investigating these things. So this has led to Congress passing a new law obliging witnesses, even with security clearances, to tell what they know, whether about black projects trying to develop this aviation tech or other ET possibilities, no matter how low the probability, as Michael was speculating on. And it also led to the Director of National Intelligence, John Radcliffe, reporting in 2021 that this was a population of objects, so multiple situations, not just a couple. So like with remote viewing, Mike, swings and roundabouts. First it's real, then it's false and even a complete joke, and now it's real again. Has your bullshitometer sort of skipped from side to side at all on this UFO issue over the years, or are you just calmly waiting for physical evidence?
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot there. I've been writing about this for a long time. The first of all, the 2017 New York Times article. Okay, this is not by New York Times journalists writing objective investigative journalistic articles. This is by Leslie Kean, a longtime UFO proponent, and her co-authors, one of whom was Ralph Blumenthal, who wrote a biography of John Mack, who believed that people are being abducted by aliens. So this is not like the neutral news department going, "Hey, we got this story. Let's," like they quoted, "The Pentagon says they're real." David Fravor, the videos, the UAP videos. Everybody heard that. What they heard was, "Oh my God, the Pentagon says the aliens are real." That's not what they said.
No,
They said
not
the
aliens.
videos are real. Okay, the videos are real. They're not fake. So what? What are the videos? They're these grainy, blurry videos. You can't quite see what's going on. And now we have perfectly valid explanations, thanks in part to McWest, of exactly what we're looking at here. And, I could just go on and on about this. I mean, there's something on the order of 2 billion smartphones that have high resolution cameras that can record video and still photographs of everything that you can see billions and billions of photos. There's not one of a high resolution, clear UFO, alien spaceship or Chinese spy drone. It's obviously what it is. Not one out of the billions. And Fravor was on 60 Minutes. He tells the 60-minute correspondents, "Oh, we see these things every day. Every day, there must be millions of photographs that the Department of Defense has. Or you have on your cell phone. Nope, nothing. Okay, how can this be?" Right? And so, okay, what about all these anomalies? All right. The vast majority, even the hardcore ufologists, claim are fully explicable. I'll just read you the list here from my own chapter on this in my forthcoming book, Truth. This is from Leslie Kean herself. Her book is called, 2010 book is called UFOs, Generals, Pilots, and Government Officials Go on the Record. She says in her book, roughly, I'm quoting her now, roughly 90 to 95% of UFO sightings can be explained as weather balloons, flares, sky lanterns, planes flying in formation, secret military aircraft, birds reflecting the sun, planes reflecting the sun, blimps, helicopters, the planet Venus or Mars, meteors or meteorites, space junk, satellites, swamp gas, spinning eddy, sundogs, ball lightning, ice crystals, reflected light off clouds, lights on the ground, or lights reflected in the cockpit window, temperature inversions, hole punch clouds, and the list goes on. Okay, if 90 to 95% of all the sightings can be explained, then what we're left with is just 5 to 10% of anomalous, unexplained things. Okay, so this is called the
Tic Tac, like 1952. What are we talking?
Tic Tac
Black
is
Tech?
no.
Black
These are
Project?
probably balloons or the exhaust from a jet engine. Again, you can't see what these things are. They're not clear at all. Just your viewers just go on YouTube and watch these videos. It's like, what am I looking at? It's just this kind of blurry, grainy thing.
So the pilots who saw that thing accelerating and making
They think
right
that's
angle,
what they saw. Okay,
right
there's a great
angle.
video of the astronaut Scott Kelly, who was one of the space shuttle astronauts, who's also a pilot, lifelong pilot. He's now a senator from Arizona, and he talks about this. He gave a press conference a couple of months ago after the Grush congressional testimony, in which he said this business about
Crazy claim.
pilots and astronauts are better at perceiving things, and they can see things that others can't, and they're better eyewitnesses. He goes, that's nonsense. And he gave lots of examples of this. Like, he's flying his jet and his co-pilot says, "Oh my God, look at that thing over there." And let's go back. What was it? It was a UFO. And then they went back. It was a Bart Simpson balloon. Another one where his co-pilot wanted to land. He wanted to go investigate this thing that was up in the air. It wasn't. It was a buoy on the ocean. He tells the story of his brother in one of the space shuttle, in which they were about to close the bay doors, the cargo bay doors, and somebody goes, "Oh my God, there's a tool in there. They could see it. Look, it's floating around in there. We got to go get this thing before we close. We must have left this tool floating around." And then like 45 minutes later, they go, "Wait a minute, that's the International Space Station 85 miles away." And he said, "I have hundreds of stories like this. Pilots are not better eyewitnesses. We mistake things all the time."
Yeah.
So get that out of your head. Okay. And again, we've been, hearing these stories. It actually goes back to long before Roswell, the 1890s. There was an airship. There were airship sightings all over America. Newspapers covered it. You can read the stories about it. And, oh my God, these mysterious airships are everywhere. This is right around the time when people were experimenting with balloons, with big balloons, with, airships. And, and so 1950s was the time 1940s and 50s, when we were experimental aircraft. And then there was the Project Mogul, which is the high altitude balloon trains that were lofting way up in the upper atmosphere, acoustic equipment to listen for possible upper atmosphere Soviet nuclear tests. And they launched hundreds of these things. I was just reading more about this recently, in which this balloon company in Michigan that made something like 600,000 balloons for the government. And they launched, hundreds of thousands of these things all over the United States. So
is that what you think 1952 was? The buzzing of Capitol Hill and that squadron? I mean, that was seen by thousands and thousands of people.
Yeah,
covered by
same thing with the Phoenix Lights was seen by thousands of people, but they're just flares. They're just flares. They were military flares. So people saw something.
Why did they scramble jets then? Why did they scramble
who knows?
military
Who knows? I don't know. I don't know that particular one. But again, what's more likely? That 90, 95%, probably 99% of these things are fully explicable, and the other 1% represent what? Aliens?
Or I'm not sure. Also, I'm assuming black projects, but
okay, black projects. Let's say it's black projects from China or Russia. Okay,
or us.
so
or us, more likely,
or our own. Okay, but we know a lot about the history of science and technology. That no country gets very far ahead of any other country for very long at all. We steal each other's secrets. People copy each other. All inventions are cumulative from previous inventions, very close to them. There's no single invention anywhere ever that doesn't have an immediate predecessor that we know about. That's published in books. It's made it. It's in the patent office or whatever. Even the Manhattan Project, the most secret project in the history of the United States. The Russians had a bomb within 3 years. How'd they get it? They stole it. They had a spy at Los Alamos. We spy on the Chinese. We know exactly their technology. They know our technology. Or just taking the private sector, just smartphones and computers. They're all pretty much the same. Even though Google and Samsung and all these companies, Apple, they all have, extremely secure property rights and secrets, and they protect, protect their properties. And yet they all are pretty much the same. How is it that happens? They steal each other's.
Just to clarify then, Lou Elizondo, ATIP, all these reports, you literally throw them all out. There's not a single one
stop,
you would...
Stop.
No, I'm just confirming.
I understand. I
know
that's what it sounds like. I'm not doing that. The government has had a crash retrieval program since World War I. Why? Because airplanes crash, and we want to know why ours crashed, and we want to know what the other guys are doing. What are those Germans doing? What are their planes like? And this is why all biplanes are pretty much the same. This is why all the fighter jets, all the fighter airplanes in World War II were pretty much the same. The Zero was better than our plane. So within 2 years, we had a plane better than the Zero. And same thing with the Messerschmitt, the various German planes, the British had a better one than theirs within no time, and so on. And it was, we all steal each other's secrets, or we just copy, or you just look stuff up and just back engineer. That's what the crash retrieval programs are. So when you hear about Luel's,
Elizondo,
yes. When you hear him talking about, the debris, well, what is it exactly it was? Well, my friend knows somebody who said they saw this thing that was off-world. How do you know it's off-world? How do you know it's not just crash retrieval of a satellite, a Russian jet, a missile from China, whatever? We do that. Of course we do that. But that doesn't mean it's aliens. Right?
Absolutely not. Yeah. Pretty sure Nick Pope, ex-MOD,
I know Nick,
the Weird Desk. I'm pretty sure he's got some pretty amazing photos. If you're looking to,
he doesn't. I know Nick. He's on the Galileo project with me with Avi Loeb.
Yes, it was fantastic. It was great to talk to Avi about that, and I loved his logic on this, where he said, "Listen, we certainly can't wait for the government to tell us about it. Let's just set up a bit of decent software to check this out, and it's probably all nothing, but it'd be nice to settle this once and for all."
Just so your listeners know, I'm not dogmatically closed-minded to this. I'm totally supportive of the Galileo project. Let's find out. And I agree, from what we were talking about earlier, we're very, very, very probably 99.9% not alone in the universe. It would be astonishing. Trillions and trillions of planets in our galaxy alone, and then times 100 billion galaxies, or maybe 1 trillion galaxies in the universe. The chances of, it would be astonishing if we were the only ones. But it's a big, big universe. It's mostly empty space. The chances of them finding us very slim.
Mm.
Much less this idea, you hear these things about back engineering computer technology or silicon chips from the spacecraft, and that improved on our vacuum tube computers, as if the aliens are going to be like 5 years ahead of us.
Well, listeners, it leaves me just to say that we have the great privilege of speaking in this series to Gary Nolan, Stanford pathologist, and somebody who's been brought in to verify some of these supposedly alien bodies, and on quite a few occasions he's been the bringer of bad news.
You had Nolan on the show?
Gary's in this series as well.
Oh, yeah, he won't talk to me.
I'm sure
because I'm going to ask him for evidence. Show me.
Absolutely. Well, the evidence that I want to talk to him about is going to be about first of all his study of the brains of experiences, both dead and alive, both military and non-military experiences with these strange mutations in their brain. And the other bit of evidence we're going to talk to him about is these anomalous materials, which, you know, he's an inventor of pathological machines, these machines for going deep into the structure, both biological and supposedly man-made tech. And he's been passed some material that he can't identify as either biological, i.e. Of natural source. It's definitely an alloy, but it's not something that he has come across as a man-made technologies. So it'll be interesting to get his point of view. And we're also going to be speaking to the wonderful Diana Pasulka, the first theologist to come on our show.
Another one who turned me down. She won't talk to me. Even though I had her on the show
Michael,
once, she says,
there are not many people like me who want to get everybody on the show.
She knows I'm going to say, come on, show us the evidence. And it's always going to be, well,
that's your job.
Can't.
That's your job, Michael. Everybody knows that if it's not sort of physical, hold in your hand stuff, but what I'm interested in speaking with Diana about is more about the reason that she was pulled in, which is to look to the religiosity of this experience, to look to
I think that's what it is. I think
how these phenomena can come into even collective experiences. And I think that is a fascinating question about the nature of consciousness.
The same way myths and religions do.
Absolutely. But it's interesting, Michael.
But they're not real.
I think it's really important. I think it's really important you keep asking these folks, you know, and I've been very, very lucky that they've said yes. And I just want to appreciate, I want to, you know, say thank you to you, Michael, for coming on a show where, you know, we're considering all of this stuff. We're talking to Dean Radin, we're talking to Gary, we're talking to Avi Loeb, we're talking to everybody who, you know, you are putting on the grill, and you're making sure that they are, you know, but you do it respectfully. And so, you know, if Gary or Diana are listening, you know, Michael will do it with respect. Trust me.
Well, thank you. I hope so.
So,
all right.
Well, it just leaves me to thank you very much for your time. Listeners, do go out and get the book Conspiracy. I did not expect Michael to have such an open point of view. I thought it would be much more of a conspiracy bashing event. So once again, he showed how sweet and open, and literally he just needs evidence and reason. So I think, you know, some of the tools provided in those books are really, really useful. Michael Shermer, thank you.
Thank you for saying that. I appreciate that.